Okay, so let's talk a little bit about my technology biography. I was turned on to technology way back in elementary school. I went to school here, Grafton Elementary School in Lorain County, Ohio. I don't really remember the computer being used for a whole lot except to play math games if I finished my work early. But the one thing I do remember the most about the computer that we had in the classroom, instead of a floppy drive or a hard drive, what this computer had was a cassette drive. Now, I talked about this computer all the time, so my dad eventually went out and bought me this Commodore 64. He didn't want this Commodore 64 to turn into a ColecoVision. Remember the ColecoVision? So what he did was he bought me Run Magazine. Run Magazine was all this information about how to use a Commodore 64 for more than just playing games. But one of my favorite parts of the was in the very back of the magazine. It was always a short little snippet of programming, and this was one of the first times I really got to see how computers could be more than just a game. In high school, we were inspired by a Saturday Night Live skit. What we did was we used our computer knowledge to create fake letters and fake signs that we hung around the school and stores in our neighborhood. And time goes on. Eventually, I'm a student at the University of Toledo. Near the end of my freshman year, my roommate Dave, who was an engineering major, gets a letter from NASA Lewis, which now is actually NASA Glenn Research Center, but it was asking him to apply for an internship. He didn't apply mainly because he didn't live in the Cleveland area. Even though I wasn't qualified, I still applied. Of course, I didn't get it. But they had a position for me. This position was basically data entry. I like space so much, I was just excited to be working at NASA. I took the information from a floppy disk and typed it into a program that created graphs for engineers to read. I was required to be at my job for 8 hours a day, even though it really only took me about 7 to complete it. At first, I played around with that extra hour. But what I eventually began to do with that extra hour was write a little program that would do my work for me. It took a while, but I was able to create a program that would do the work that took 7 hours by hand. I could do it in about 8 minutes. It was basically a primitive version of a mail merge. I often refer to this as the biggest scam of my life because I was getting paid for only doing 8 minutes of work. I spent the extra time making friends with the scientists, and I was eventually able to see the wind tunnel in action. After this, I continued on with school. Please remember at this time, Ed Tech was really not a thing. My final exam in my undergrad Ed Tech class consisted of me demonstrating to the rest of the class how to replace a burnt out bulb on an overhead projector. We need to fast forward a couple of years now. Regretfully, during my first few years of teaching, I used technology as something for the students to do after they completed their work and were tired of watching hamster dance. I began the way most people do. I used technology to replace something I had already done. Instead of handwriting an essay, a student would compose that same essay in a word processing program. Eventually, things started changing. Students would create a PowerPoint instead of writing an essay. I know it's not revolutionary now, but it was kind of at the time. And in time, we began using the internet, not as a toy, but as a real research tool. Instead of wondering about the route taken to walk 2 moons, we can now follow Sal and her grandparents. We could actually look at some of the same monuments in the same places that they saw on their trip. Now I'm constantly looking for new ways to use technology in the classroom to do things that we could not do before. I try to avoid the bells and whistles of technology and begin to focus on exactly what technology can do to help students.